Hey there, guys. Alright, today we are back with some more of the Great War. This time, week 102, the Battle of the Somme, and Brusilov on his own. You could not tell by the sound of my voice, which to me, I feel like I sound super nasally or something right now. I have been sick the last few days. I have a headache right now, so for these next few videos, I might not be talking all that much. But I would love for it to be different, but YouTube doth demand that you upload with a schedule, and so I must obey my overlords, because otherwise, they already don't recommend my videos, so actually, really, what difference would it make? They want to recommend my videos more? I feel like they can't really recommend them even less than they already are. The dicks. Anyways, let's go ahead and dive right in.
The Battle of Verdun had been fought for over 4 months now. The Brusilov offensive was a month old, and this week they were joined as one of the biggest and bloodiest battles in human history also kicked off. This week saw the beginning of the Battle of the Somme. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, the Austrians released cyanide gas on the Italians, though it was the Italians who advanced on the Asiago Plateau. The Russian advance in Galicia slowly came to a halt as German reinforcements made a big difference, and the Germans began moving troops and artillery to the Somme, where an Allied artillery barrage throughout the week heralded an impending offensive. Here's what came next. Well, that offensive finally began. We beat them on the Marne, we beat them on the Aisne, we gave them hell at Neuve-Chapelle, and here we are again.
Woo.
On the morning of July 1st, over 250...
Ooh, they're whipping out some fancy animations now. Ooh.
1,000 shells were fired on the Germans in little over an hour. That's 3,500 per minute. The barrage was so intense that it could be heard north of London. At 7:20
Damn.
and 7:28, mines were exploded beneath the German trenches, and then 2 minutes later, at 7:30, the British and French attacked along a 40-kilometer front. The Battle of the Somme had begun.
Okay, wait, hold on. The Somme? That's like right over here, isn't it? But really north of London? That's not that far. That's really not that far, though. I mean, for Europeans, sure. For Americans, no, that's not fucking far. That's a jog. It's a little detour.
John Keegan wrote, "This is the moment that has come to symbolize the whole of the Great War. The lions led by donkeys school see it as a savage indictment of the stupidity of British generals. The long lines of overburdened men stumbling towards the German machine guns are painted as victims, dying for no reason. However, it is crucial to dispel that myth. The British generals' tactics were the best that could have been conceived at the time. But the attack was a disaster."
I mean, that's up for debate. It depends on the goal of the war that you are trying to set. And to be fair, I would still call the British generals pretty stupid, just in the sense that the way that they are fighting this war has always been to starve out the Germans, pretty much. They have long given up. By this point, they've given up on a quick victory. The British plan by now is to starve them out. And you don't starve them out by throwing your men at the lines. Now, granted, of course, if we believe them in that they truly are doing the Somme as a means to divert forces away from Verdun, sure, but it just kind of feels like, yeah, no, I don't. Now, I would disagree that those are the best plans that could be come up with at the time.
The artillery had, in many places, failed to cut the barbed wire, especially where they mostly fired shrapnel shells and not high explosive shells. The German defense system was still totally intact, and the attacks were not so much a story of British incompetence, but rather the strength of the German defenses and their resilience. There were upward of 100 German machine guns that had been in armored nests that had survived the artillery, and they opened fire as the infantry poured from the trenches. The attackers had to bunch together to get through what were surprisingly small gaps in the German barbed wire, and they were killed en masse. Most British soldiers carried over 60 pounds of equipment: the rifle, grenades, ammunition, rations, 4 empty sandbags, a shovel, field dressing, a steel helmet, 2 gas helmets, a water bottle, and a mess tin. I read
What's with the 4 empty sandbags?
in Martin Gilbert that General Edmonds wrote in his official history, "The weight of this equipment made it difficult to get out of the trench, impossible to move much quicker than a slow walk, or to rise and lie down quickly." 2 German-held villages, Mametz and Montalban, were captured by the British that day, and the Leipzig redoubt, a German strongpoint. The cost in men, though, was the highest that day of any day of battle in the entire war. The British took 57,470 casualties. 19,240 of those were men killed. There were actions like this one. The 6th Royal Warwicks reached their goal near Serres, but when German machine guns hit them from both flanks, they retreated to their starting point. 836 men had set out. 520 of them were killed and 316 wounded. If you add that up, every single man was either killed or wounded. The only British Dominion force fighting that day from Newfoundland was nearly totally destroyed. Of 810 men, only 100 returned unharmed. Still, the intensity of the attack and its scale caused the Germans to immediately transfer 2 divisions and 60 heavy guns up from Verdun, and it seemed to be an end to the German search of victory there. The French attack south of the British...
I mean, I guess the British achieved their goal, again, if we accept the belief that it was the goal of this objective was entirely, purely only to divert forces away from Verdun, but at such a heavy cost, is it worth it?
Under General Émile Fayolle were more successful. In the first place, the Germans weren't...
I feel like maybe if they had been a bit more patient or something, maybe they could have figured out a little bit a different sort of plan. Because I feel like it's not like the Germans were... Like, I would understand the sense of urgency in trying to create a diversion if it was felt like the French were close to breaking at Verdun. But from what we've heard so far in the battle so far, the French lines they've come close. Certainly they've come close, but the Germans have not been capitalizing on those situations. But like by now, I feel like the French lines, if I'm remembering right, the French lines have pretty much somewhat stabilized over at Verdun. They're not peaking. I don't know. It's hard to view any battle in this war as having a purpose. The whole war is essentially a pointless war.
Expecting an attack there. In the second, the French
That is the great
had a lot
tragedy
more
of World War
experience
I.
of offensive action than the British, and the French artillery was ruthless. The French also had a greater proportion of heavy guns than the British, and they soon put the German guns out of action and destroyed a lot of the machine gun emplacements. The French infantry smashed through the German lines and took the villages of Frise, Dompierre, Becancourt, Faye, Herbecourt, and Asseville, but they were aware that the British were lagging behind. So they paused. By the time they renewed the offensive, the Germans had reinforced, and then the French had it just as hard as the British did. Still, by July 4th, the French had broken through the Germans on a 10-kilometer front. Now, British wounded began reaching London in immense, endless convoys that day, even as the battle became a struggle for small woods and tiny villages. Proper identification for hundreds of thousands of dead would be impossible, as artillery tore up the bodies and then the corpses. The Germans, though, had tactical issues of their own to deal with. German Army Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn had made clear that all lost ground must be recovered no matter what the cost. That cost would be very high, as we will see. But high costs were the new normal, it seemed, for they continued unabated on the Eastern Front.
Yay.
Alexei Brusilov's month-long offensive had been staggering, and he had repeatedly crushed the Austro-Hungarian forces, inflicting hundreds of thousands of casualties. However, since the beginning of the offensive, he himself had lost around 285,000 men killed, and at least that many wounded or taken prisoners. His reserves now were more and more often fresh recruits, and he no longer had his crack, battle-hardened troops. He had paused his offensive to regroup and meet the Austro-German counteroffensives, which had failed, and he planned to attack July 3rd, because General Alexei Evert in the north was to finally attack that day and prevent the Germans from reinforcing further south. Evert surprised everybody by attacking on July 2nd along a 7-kilometer front 20 kilometers north of Baranovichi. They had planned to attack towards Vilna, but less than 2 weeks ago, Evert had changed plans. This meant that his men were really unprepared. Their maps sucked. Their guns were unregistered because they hadn't had much time for aerial observation, and once the attack began, communications in some places were non-existent. Still, they nearly made a breakthrough, but not quite. And on the 4th and the 5th, when they renewed the assault, they were mown down. Evert rested his troops on the 6th and 7th, and the Germans added 2 regiments to their lines. And when the Russians attacked on the 8th, in ranks 10 or 12 deep, using the same failed tactics they had in 1914 and 1915, 6 Russian divisions could not defeat 1 Austrian corps backed by 1 German reserve division. The Tsar had this to say: "Many of our commanding generals are silly idiots who, even after 2 years of warfare, cannot learn the first and simplest lessons in warfare." He was right. In 7 days, Evert used more shells than Brusilov used the whole month of June, and his army took 80,000 casualties while inflicting only 16,000. General Kuropatkin, who was also to strike from the bridgeheads at Riga, made one brief foray this week, and that was it. Brusilov was basically on his own. The focal point of his whole operation now was Kovel and then Lemberg. And let's be clear, even with the Somme now in full swing, Brusilov succeeding was the best chance for a real decision in the war so far. If he could once again break through, then Romania would quite likely join the war with Russia, and Austria-Hungary would be defeated. He thought it was worth the risk. And when Brusilov launched his attack on the 4th, he immediately opened gaps in the Austro-German lines and took Kopili, and on the 5th threatened to roll up the whole Styr front once again. By the end of the week, the Russians had broken through the Polish Legion and separated it from the Austrians. The endless Russian infantry poured into the gap, and General Alexander von Linsingen ordered the entire Austrian northern sector to retreat 100 kilometers to behind the Stochod River. There was one other notable city, though, that fell this week. The Battle of Mecca came to an end after 3 weeks on July 4th, with the Sharifan army victorious, taking the holy city from the Ottoman Empire. The Arab revolt was now 1 month old and held both Jeddah and Mecca. And a week of carnage ends. The British bleeding themselves to death against the Germans. The French faring a bit better. The Russians in the north again failing on a gigantic scale, while to the south, the Brusilov steamroller rolls on. Think, there are now 3 campaigns going on at once, and 2 of those would have over 1 million casualties each, while the other one would be close to 1 million. War on that kind of scale had never before happened in human history. Think of the Brusilov offensive. In just 1 month, the Russians have lost 500,000 men, and they're winning. In fact, they're winning big. We've now reached a point where you can lose 500,000 men in 1 month, and that's success. That is modern war. You might have seen that our animations for the Battle of the Somme looked a bit different this week than they usually do. That's because they were made by Epic History TV, which is a great historical YouTube.
Oh my god. Oh yeah, would this be around when Epic History TV started taking off? Oh goddamn.
Channel with more top-notch animated history. You can check out his video about the first day of the Somme right here.
Man, how far Epic History has come because their animations are so much better than back then. Wow. Well, that was the Battle of the Somme, Brusilov on his own in the Great War, week 102. One thing I love about this series is really it does a good job by taking this week by week. We can really see the how close the war is, right? We get a better grasp of, because like when you take this war and look at it on the broad terms, right? You kind of get the illusion that the Russian army was a mess the entire time and that they never were close to victory. With this week, we have had two instances where I think you can confidently say that the Russians were close to winning this war, or at least, of course, I've made the argument that the Germans probably could have done better if they didn't have to worry about the Austrians to their south. That, of course, is up for debate. But the Russians are now coming close twice to having taken out Austria-Hungary, and that's something that is not talked about when you talk about this war in its broad strokes. Right, the Brusilov offensive is talked about, but it's talked about in its failure because it didn't achieve what it set out to do, which I think is a wrong approach to do sometimes with history, especially with battles like this, because while it is a failure, and I make jokes about these generals and their stupidity and their plans and the lives that it costs, but for Brusilov's offensive, right, his goal may have been to take out Austria-Hungary. But when we take into account what he is dealing with on the internal side for the Russians and the opponent he is facing in Germany, supplemented by Austria-Hungary soldiers, and the length of that front that he's trying to push on, I feel like what he was able to do and what he came close to doing is commendable on its own. That could just be me. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.